Hello,
Perfect.
welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris Hall. This is the NDIS Peak Provider podcast. And today I have the pleasure of having Joanne Hewitt on with me. Now, Joanne is the CEO of Achieve Australia. And Achieve Australia is one of the top 25 organisations in Australia in terms of disability supports and the various things that they do. So today we're going to have a deep and meaningful conversation about strategy, leadership, and the philosophy of what the industry's meant to be and is about. So, Joanne, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thanks for inviting me.
Oh, pleasure. So, look, I like to go straight in there with the very meaningful questions. So, I'll start off with this one. In my 12 years of being a business owner myself, there have been times where I've deviated from my core business, and I learned that lesson early on. So that basically in my experience, any time that I'd deviate too much from the core, it was almost like a rubber band. It would snap back and give a bit of recall and maybe a little bit of whiplash. So here's my question for you. In the context of, Achieve Australia, you do so much, right? You've got a broad scope. It's at scale. And in the context of doing so much, what would you say is the core of Achieve Australia's business?
Look, I think that's a really good question in this environment because I think, when the NDIS came in, there was a tendency for organisations to jump in and say, we just need to do more of lots of things so that we can remain viable. And, lots of people went into some pretty bizarre things, I have to say. Achieve Australia does really focus in on delivering support services to people with disability, and the core of our services are NDIS related services. So we don't have any other bits and pieces hanging off. But, nonetheless, there are a range of ways that we support people. Our largest footprint, in fact, 80% of our service delivery is delivering supports to people living at home. So whether they're living in specialist disability accommodation, and that ranges from people in apartment living as well as in group homes, in freestanding houses and villas. But 80% of that support is around people who are actually living at home, whether by themselves or in a shared environment. Mm. Whilst we support people with a range of disability types, we also have a particular expertise in supporting people with really complex needs, including people with significant physical and mental health conditions, and particularly people approaching the end of their lives. Many of the people that we support are either getting older, or often people who have lived in institutions for a lot of their lives. And so with that comes some significant health issues, and young people who have really such significant and complex health conditions that their life is limited. So that's a particular area of expertise that we've developed and that is really at the core of our services.
Okay.
And to complement our extensive team of support workers, we also have a large cohort of registered nurses with specific expertise in supporting people with disability. And so that assists with ensuring that people still, remain in the community, live good lives, and don't have to go in and out of hospital or stay for long extended periods of time in hospital, but can get their right healthcare in the right setting.
Exactly. It's all about competencies, right? So, the RN angle can support, for example, module 1 and complex care, understanding complex mental health conditions, the psychosocial piece. Of course, there's competencies on restrictive practice where applicable. It all comes together, right? And the distinction of primarily helping people at home, of course, that can span SDA. It can be people's own personal homes and personal care activities. And it does, it could, but I want to ask, do you what's the relativity of, for example, supported independent living inside of that mix? Because you've got all three sort of areas that you can help people in a home environment, right?
Yeah, for sure. And look, the bulk of our funding envelope comes from, or the people's packages actually comes from supported independent living.
Yes.
With a mix of people who are on independent living options packages and other people who might have drop-in support kind of in their package, but the bulk of it is supported independent living. But once again, people, we support people in, say, a one-bedroom apartment who have a SIL package that might even have some shared supports in there, but we can support them because we have other people living in that complex who also have packages.
There's some of the kind of the medium-sized providers that I consult with. I see sometimes a trend, which is an interesting one on the SDA side, to not always go into developing the properties themselves, but to collaborate with other SDA providers. And when you compare it to SIL, like as a smaller business owner, for example, there's sometimes a case to be made to say, gosh, I can collaborate with the SDA provider because they get what they get. And then for us as a company, we de-risk relative to SIL because essentially, for want of a better word, the rent's taken care of, kind of thing. Like there's not as much risk in terms of property ownership, or do you have to rent out SIL properties, etc. Just out of interest on that kind of angle of things, do you have any comments on that? And do you take an
I
attitude?
certainly do.
Yeah, I'm sure. Like I'm
Yes.
intrigued to kind of like, what's your approach to that?
So at Achieve Australia, we've taken the view for a long time that that people with disability need to live like most people and not, have their care provided by the person who owns their house. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we actually separated our SDA from SIL, and we sold the properties that we owned and transferred the management of the other properties to SDA providers. We actually went into partnership with a commercial provider of a commercial property developer, Left Field Social Housing, to set up Inclusive Housing Australia, which is an SDA company. And so work really closely with them around a proportion of our properties, and those are the properties that we previously owned that we sold to IHA. But we also work with other SDA providers. So we work with a number of community providers as well as other SDA providers who provide the accommodation, and we provide the care and support. So we've taken that from a philosophical perspective, that people, can choose where they live, who they live with, and not be dependent upon the care and support that they receive.
I think that's really powerful, and it's arguably the way it should be done. I know that there can, of course, be cases maybe for the smaller providers where it's not as realistic, but I think philosophically it's very much on point. So yeah, it's kind of what it's doing is it's removing the theoretical conflict of interest as well. So there's less
absolutely
psychological pressure, for example, to stay committed to one person or not. It's all about, I think it's more meritocratic as well, isn't it? Basically, do you want to use Achieve Australia's supports? Well, meritocracy will decide that, i.e. focus on doing a great job on support work itself.
Yeah. And look, it's not without its challenges. And but we make sure that we remain very collegiate with our SDA providers, and work in partnership with them. But we're agnostic as to who provides the SDA. In the same way as we expect that the SDA provider is agnostic as to who provides SIL, because that is really the choice of the participant.
Absolutely. I think a few years ago there used to be a bit more informal, like, oh, this is our preferred SIL provider, for example, that the SDA company might make that statement. But I'm glad to see there seems to be, I think, with the larger SDA operators, that philosophical agnostic approach in a good way. It's like, yeah, sure, we collaborate with these people and these people and these people, but it's your choice. It's how it should be.
Yeah. And look, it's not always possible to separate some of that, in that if you if you have a house where 3 people are sharing, and their SIL supports are shared, then you can't have 3 SIL providers providing that support. So it always gets tricky about how that works. But
I want to hear your point of view on this. Actually, this gets my juices going. This one, Joanne. So, like, SIL, when it comes to anything that's less than 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, is the model broken? So what I mean by that is, as a business owner, right? I think about things of risk and strategy, and I when I go to, I can't quite make my mind up about this as a consultant, right? So if I think about, say, a 1-to-3 instance, of course you need that third participant for the business case to kind of work in terms of it being a sustainable model. As soon as it's even 2, never mind 1, like you're basically at risk of operating at a loss. Right. So that's what I mean in the context of that question. It's kind of quite it's charged, but like, is it a broken model? So what I mean by that even further is the, again, philosophical question: most SIL plans, well, not all of them, are agency managed, right? So you've got the agency paying the bills, and that's great. But does there need to be better coordination, perhaps at the scheme level, to say not guarantee providers would get, say, 3 participants in one house, but a bit more, yeah, coordination there, because otherwise
Yeah,
it
look,
threatens
no,
the
you're
market
absolutely
failure.
right. I mean,
Yeah,
I always hesitate to say something's broken because
sure,
there
sure.
are no doubt challenges with SIL.
Yeah.
And part of the challenge is that, well, the reputation it's gained, and that's really, you know, by virtue of how it's been funded. So people coming into the scheme have often been, and it depends on your planner, often been inappropriately placed in SIL settings because they might have, you know, requests that that go above and beyond
Yeah.
what the planner might think is reasonable, and so forced into a SIL environment where they've got to share supports. Now, having said that, you know, it's not realistic to expect that everybody's going to get 24-hour a day, 7-day a week
Yeah.
um, supports in the home where they want it, when they want it, because there's not enough money anywhere to do that. It's not realistic. But, you know, SIL has often been the blunt instrument that that people go to, and the market's not mature enough yet to actually look at how that's going to work for everyone, not just the traditional cohort in SIL. So that's one issue. The other issue, I guess, is that because it's an individualized system, so the problem is it's together, and then the other problem is it's funded individually.
Yes.
So people are funded for their particular needs. So we've had situations where, you know, there's 3 people living in a house and 2 people require overnight support, and one person doesn't require overnight support. So the agency, in their wisdom, will fund the 2 people for a third each, and then the other person doesn't get any funding. And so we then got to pay the other third because you can't get 2/3 of a person to work overnight.
Exactly.
And those sorts of things come up all the time, that that coordination around how the whole fits together, and then how the individuals get the support they need and make those choices individually. So it's a tricky equation, and there needs to be much more coordination about how that works. And to your point earlier, you know, if somebody leaves or passes away and there's a vacancy for a period of time, then how does the provider actually, you know, keep that service going for the 2 people who are still only funded on a 3-to-1 equation?
Exactly.
So it does get very challenging. In big organisations, we just tend to wear it. And I think the agency sort of relies on the fact that we do, although, you know, when it comes to when we start talking about viability of organisations, I know that, you know, most organisations are really struggling and suffering losses every year, and particularly the big SIL providers. So, you know, we're covering it, but because we have to, because we need to. It's a duty of care to the people we support and to our staff to make sure that we've got the right staffing model in place.
Correct. And so yeah, I mean, to the, as you just perfectly said, like it's the context of the coordination piece and the impact on business case for provider, and if indirectly but very directly, the livelihood of the other 2 participants in the 1-to-3 example. Like we shouldn't threaten their livelihood because of things changing. So you know, there's that. There's also the interesting dynamic that you can have the 1-to-3 thing for the SIL piece, but then community participation for the same participant could be 1-to-1, right? So then that takes me down the rabbit hole of, different organizations and sometimes public guardians, etc., and sport coordinators. They will make a statement that it's a conflict of interest for the SIL and the CP to be done by the same provider. And on one hand, I don't disagree with that. I get it. But in the instance where it's 1-to-3, sometimes effectively what that 1-to-1 piece does is it helps subsidize and mitigate the impact of the problems we're talking about. So you know, again, like if you think about, it's not just coordination, it's almost philosophy. Because if you go to, say, the New South Wales Public Trustee and Guardian, if they're always saying nope for someone that's under guardianship, nope, you can't do the CP as well, that again could, in principle, you know, threaten viability, couldn't it?
Oh,
So
absolutely. It
yeah.
also, I mean, you know, I fall in the middle somewhere there too, because I
Mm,
absolutely think that, we as organizations have to actually be thinking about those conflict of interest all the time,
yes.
and have to be thinking about how do we not capture people in that service environment and make them dependent upon us, because it's so easy to do. And we
Mhm.
do it unconsciously. It's not
Yep.
that people are out there trying to do it. Some people are, but trying to do it purposefully, but it happens unconsciously. And because people in an environment where they're not used to shopping around, and they're not exposed to other service providers, then it's very easy for them to say, "Oh, I'll just take you
Mhm.
because I know you and I like you."
Mhm.
But at the same time, there's room for people to actually do that, and sometimes the circumstances lend itself to it. It's much better for this that service provider to be providing the CP. So I think there's got to be some flexibility in the system,
Mhm.
and there's got to be external oversight to make sure that that's not about organisations just capturing people and over servicing them.
Correct. Yep. No, well said. Well said. It's not an easy answer at all. Yeah. Okay. So I want to go to heritage here for a second. So Achieve
Yeah.
Australia has been going since 1952. It's amazing. So how do you incorporate, I guess, the benefits of that heritage into your value proposition?
Yeah, look, Chris, I think that's a really important thing to be acknowledging and talking about constantly in all of our organisations. Achieve Australia, like many disability organisations, was started off in the 50s, in that period of time where parents usually were kicking back on the social policy that meant that you had to put your kids with disability into care and go off and forget about them, have other children. Never worked, but that's what people were asked to do. And people, of course, started to question that, and raised money themselves to actually set up organisations like ours to make sure that their kids could actually live in the community, be part of their families, be part of regular society. And I guess that's what I hold dear. That was
Mm,
the it might have been done in a different way to what we do it now. We
mhm,
might have put people in groups of 30, and then we moved to groups of six, and now people say groups of six are dreadful.
mm,
But everybody was doing the next iteration of what was best, and how we can move people into the community. And so keeping that legacy alive around what was
mm,
the intent. The intent
mm,
was for people with disability to take their rightful place, to have choice, to have connection with their community and family. And that's what drives,
mm,
the work that we do every day.
mm,
I launched my new strategic plan yesterday, and the thing I always talk about is that, we talk about inclusion, and it's
mm,
a really overused word. And
mhm,
people often think that inclusion means you go out, you're there basically. If you let into the club, you are included. Well, that's not what inclusion really means.
mm.
Inclusion is about having that experience of belonging.
I
So
agree.
you're not
Yep.
just sitting around the kitchen table, but everybody's talking about you rather than to you.
Very
You're
much
not
so.
just
Yes.
sitting at the club with your support worker in the corner, but you're actually doing the things that you love doing with the people that you enjoy doing it with.
100%. That is so close to my heart. My son's autistic, and so therefore will have some things that he needs, right? Whether it be sensory overload in certain situations.
Mm,
So,
mm.
like, I have such a deep appreciation for that now as a father. And I'm going to make myself cry in a second. What it means to me is literally that pure acceptance of, like, if things are too loud for him, adjust that, accommodate that,
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
challenge it. You would
yeah.
never make him wrong for that, or any of
Mm,
the things that can happen unconsciously when maybe it's other people, even friends in your life. There's an education piece there, isn't there?
sure.
Being truly inclusive there means actually probably getting people to have an understanding of just what it means, so therefore there is that immediate acceptance rather than oh, what's going on, is
Mm.
he okay,
Control your child.
yeah, exactly. So I mean,
I know what that's like.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's kind of almost a comment on. I'm not saying things are done badly, but, like, I think what the good news is that we've come so far since the 50s, right? So, but broadly, the rest of society, so to speak, I hope over time we'll just continue to get better at that. So it's definitely
Absolutely. Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
do, as
Yeah.
organizations. And then it's the broad ecosystem, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, I think that legacy question is so important because,
Mm,
at the moment there's a lot of rhetoric around about, living in a one-bedroom apartment, good. Living in a SIL group home, bad,
mhm,
shocking. There's
mm,
awful
mhm,
service
mm.
providers are keeping people in these group homes, and I'm no apologist for group homes. But, we've got to say, okay, there's always a continuum about how things move and change. And there are better options for people around how they live and where they live. And we've got to get housing right for people with disability and care and support right for people with disability.
Mhm.
But it's not a good, bad conundrum. It's a how do we continue to make things more inclusive, to actually
Yes.
get better quality housing for people, get more choice about who you live with. Not everybody wants to, or it's in their interest to live in a one-bedroom apartment.
Mhm, mhm.
There are people for whom living with the friends that they've lived with for all of their lives
Yep.
it is a great thing, and
Yep.
it's what they want to do, and they grieve if they're not with those friends. They're their
Correct.
family. So, you've got to have that balance,
You
and you've got
do.
to actually say, okay, that, we can look back and say institutions were bad, and I worked in institutions, and they were not very nice places to live or work. Um, and I've worked in some group homes that were awful, and I've worked
Mhm,
in some group homes that were fabulous, that
mhm,
people lived great lives and, were really had great choice and still do.
mhm.
So, it's a question of honoring that legacy and saying, but, how do we keep moving? How do we keep
Yes.
moving forward and keep actually changing things for people so that life keeps getting better?
Absolutely right. I love that. And there are so many good news stories too, in the sense of I've just completed a project. I'm completing a project currently for a national support coordination company. And when we did
Hmm.
an analysis of the national market, we made the observation that for the 19 to 24 year old young adult category, that has, I think, it was something like 30 or 40% higher support coordination budgets on average. And that to me is a good news story, because for young people transitioning into adulthood, what that means is that there's space for things like the individualized living option ILO
Mm,
thing
mm,
that speaks
mm.
to what we just talked about. So yeah, I think there's, yeah, honestly, like people like Bill Shorten, what wonderful people. Like there's a lot of people doing good things. So yeah, I
Yep.
agree. You got to kind of know what you're actually talking about, basically to really comment on how things are going in the industry. Because I think that unfortunately, just like any classical news story, if you see something in the paper, it's typically negative, and then for people that
Mm.
don't understand the NDIS, they'll go, "Oh, there's so many people doing the rip-offs," and do they really have a
Yeah.
disability? There's a lot of ignorance, a lot of lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think too that, there's no doubt that that some people are really struggling, and that, particularly in the last several years, the way things have been implemented, it means a lot of people have had to focus on the bad things about their life, and
mhm,
there's been this scramble to get the biggest package you can and hang on to it as long as you can, which is
mhm,
really not what the intent of the NDIS was about in the first place. It was really about people having some aspiration and looking at what do you need here and now to live your best life, and that can flex up and flex down throughout your life. And that's sort of not the way things are at the moment.
mhm,
But we also lose sight of the really good news stories.
mhm,
And I know getting in taxis often, you struck up conversations with the taxi drivers, and they'll say, oh, that NDIS, what do you think about it? Like, is it
mhm,
really doing any good? And I think people lose sight of the fact that there are people who have had amazing transformative experiences with having, access to the NDIS.
mhm,
And that there are probably more of those people than there are of the ones who are really struggling, which
mhm.
doesn't negate the fact that we
No,
absolutely have to fix the things that are going wrong, and that
100%.
we have to make sure that people who are not getting what they need are actually getting what they need. But we need to hang on to the fact that it really is the greatest scheme in the world. We just need to get it right and
Yeah,
fix some of the teething problems.
yeah, absolutely. Now, I've been the chairman of a charity myself, and so I've been in the not-for-profit sector and side of things. I'm going to ask a interesting question. What are the dangers of running a not-for-profit organization?
Dangers.
Mm,
Okay. I I think your key challenges, and we started this conversation at the beginning, is around staying true to your purpose.
okay.
because it's so easy to it's so easy to get off track. It's
Okay.
easy to get off track around, what you're doing and go off
Mm.
on bandwagons, whether that's, providing different kinds of services. I mean, I've talked to some of my colleagues who are unpacking businesses that have nothing to do with, people with disability or advancing the cause of disability because somebody in their history decided that they're going to make some money from that.
Right.
Um, there's a real danger, particularly in the current economic environment, to become very transactional
Mm.
in what we do, and particularly because of the way things are funded. That you do only get a finite amount of funding, and it's got to be spent on that direct hour of service delivery, which is a good thing, but it also means that you don't have any wriggle room.
Mhm.
So that if you get 20 hours worth of support coordination per year, you only provide 20 hours of support coordination per year. So if the person needs more, they've got to go back through the plan funding cycle, and it becomes really tricky.
Mhm.
Whereas previously we were able to do a bit of swings and roundabouts, I suppose. That meant that a lot of people missed out. So I'm not saying that was a better way to go.
Mm.
But I think that's a danger, actually, to in the transactional nature of the service, is not to actually at the beginning look at, so what priority am I going to focus on? How am I going to really make the best use of that 20 hours, to take that example?
Mhm.
That we jump into service delivery and we deliver the 20 hours and then realize, oh, whoops,
Mhm.
there's something else that needs to be done, or there's something that was more important that we should have been focused on. So I think we have to actually really stand back and work out as organisations how we're
Mm.
going to deliver services in that environment.
Mhm.
At the same time, we can be lobbying to, make changes and to do different things, but it is what it is. So we've actually got to make sure that we continue to deliver on our mission, I think, is what I'm trying to say,
Yes.
within that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of advocacy and disability, right? What do you think are the biggest challenges, but also opportunities for advocacy in the NDIS?
Yeah, look, I think one of the challenges at the moment in terms of advocacy is the perception, and I believe it's only a perception, that somehow, and it's particular to big providers, and I sometimes feel a little sensitive about this, that somehow, because of the rhetoric in the sector and in the media and everything else, that there's you mentioned it before, rhetoric about
Mm.
fraud, about rip-offs,
Mm.
about and particularly when people from see the size of packages perhaps that big providers like us are receiving, and they think, oh, that's an awful lot of money.
Mm.
That's you $100 million organisation. You must, your CEO must drive a Mercedes and
Mm.
travel business class. I can assure you, I don't do either of those things. Um, and I think there can be and rightfully so, a perception from people with disability that somehow
Mm.
large service providers are just making money and not really servicing the needs of their clients. And so therefore, we all want the same things in general.
Mm.
And so trying to work together and be a cohesive voice, I think, is really, really important, because when you've got different interests, uh, actually going at it from different perspectives and not actually talking the same language, or
Mm.
criticising each other or whatever, then that's really easy for governments to go, we'll just make our own mind up because nobody's, or they'll take the view of one particular party. And so I think it's really critical that we get back to what we had, and, how we started the NDIS was that service providers actually worked really closely with people with disability and actually rallied and galvanised the people that we were supporting into lobbying for the NDIS. And there was
Mm.
this cohesive message about, this is what's going to work and this is how it's going to be fixed.
Mhm.
And somehow there's almost been a wedge driven through that, to the point where, and I know that, having conversations with other service providers, we go, oh, please, we just want to work with you and be really happy and nice, and not trying to rip anybody off. So I
Mm.
think that, bringing back the disability advocacy groups and the service providers to talk the same language, and to really get what we all want, really, because we
Mm.
want the same thing.
Yeah, correct. And that speaks to values and philosophy, etc. And it's almost like a level of consciousness, right? So if you have a dog eat dog mentality and a competitive mentality or a conflicting one, it's almost energetic. You're going to attract that. You're going to look for it. You're going to spot it. You're going to have your boxing gloves on and think it's a big war. And I'm not saying that things don't happen. Like it's true, unfortunately, that people can get poached from one place to another.
Oh, absolutely.
Unethical things
Yeah,
do happen,
yeah, they
but
do.
if you elevate yourself, it's like I feel like what you do is you start to associate with almost a community of fellow providers and other organizations that do it in arguably the right way, and then it kind
Yeah.
of becomes a non-issue, I think, when you operate at that. I'm going to use the word frequency. It literally
Yeah,
is.
and look, I have to say
Yeah.
there's movement at the moment. Yesterday I attended the Australian Disability Dialogue, which has been sponsored by the Alliance 20, and working with some really key advocates and people with disability. And that was a fantastic discussion
Mhm.
about, what to do in housing and how we might solve the housing problem for people with disability. And, that more of that kind of things, the where we can all be on the same page, work together, and because that's what's going to work. Because that's
Mhm.
that'll be listened to. If you get that single proposition, I think that all stakeholders buy into, then that's what government listens to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Now, I want to hear an inspiring story. Can you tell me any, inspiring stories from what Achieve Australia has done in terms of the impact that you've had on an individual life and the role that you played to transform, the outcomes that you got to? Like, what can you tell me some? Just don't mention people's actual names, but like, can you give
No,
us
no,
some,
no, of course not. Yeah.
ideas, about that kind of stuff?
Yeah,
There's
look,
always
I
a
could
good
probably tell
story.
you many, many, but
Yes.
one that springs to mind at the moment is a person who, had acquired a disability as an adult, and so had a family, but was in hospital for a long, long time in rehab, and was not able to go home,
Right.
because of the extent of that person's disability. She really requires 24/7 monitoring, lots of health intervention. Her family were really struggling and wondering what was going to happen. She spent an awful lot of time in hospital, like years, a couple of years.
Wow. Wow.
So she's now moved into an apartment,
Hmm.
and so is living on her own in that apartment.
Hmm.
But there are other apartments in the building. It's not an apartment block just for people with disabilities. It's a big apartment block with 400 apartments in the block. So similar to the one that I live in.
Hmm.
Um, and but there are 22 of those apartments within that block that actually are supported by Achieve Australia.
Right.
So she has access to that 24/7 care without somebody living in a lounge room. And
Yes.
so she's able to have all the care she requires. She's able to have her kids stay overnight. She's able to go down to the shops when she needs to, and somebody knows that she's gone and knows, if she's taken too long, should I check that she's okay? Can I
Mm.
ring her on a mobile phone and make sure she's okay? She does have some difficulties, even in the community. And so after even a short few months, she's
Mm.
living an amazing life. And, a hubby comes to stay, and the family are together. They're not living together, but that's an extension of their family home, I guess, now.
Yeah.
But she also has that care and support wrapped around her, and
Mm.
other people close by that
Mhm.
she can actually call and have within a moment's notice somebody coming in and supporting her.
Love that.
Yeah, so that's just one, and we also support another young woman who had a young baby, a really
Mhm.
tiny baby,
Mhm.
and was separated from that child because of her acquired disability, and managed to get full custody of the child, and
Mhm.
so now we support mum to be at home, looking after her bub, and things like that is
Mhm.
just amazing.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. That both those stories give me goosebumps. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and
That's
look, it's not
wonderful.
just, and I think because we've got
Mm.
access to nursing support, so it's not that we have
Mm.
nurses in there every day, all day, every
Mm.
day, but
Mm.
we have,
Mm.
in an environment like that, we would have a nurse on site 24 hours a day who can
Mm.
be, supervising catheter changes and doing those sort of nursing type duties, but not being there all the time, not having to ring somebody and order that in advance. They can deal with emergency as it occurs. So we've got a good clinical backstop, I guess, in
Exactly.
all of those places.
I love that, because that's the balance. It's a great story about getting someone into connected with the family and community, but also striking the balance between empowering the individual and also not invading on their personal space. Like, it's a wonderful thing. Now, everyone's got their own why, I suppose, as to why they're in the NDIS. But for me, that reminds me of my cousin in the UK who has Down syndrome, and he was always in a group environment, a group home. And I saw better versions and worse versions. And when I saw the worst versions, it's kind of like, it gets me going. I'm like, oh, I just want it to be done better. So it's great to hear these
Absolutely.
done better stories.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, going back to your experience, you were the operational, leader of Mission Australia. So just out of interest, I know we're kind of progressing through different stages of your career now, but that was, a few organizations back. Just out of interest, though, since you've got that background, do you take any particular operationally more focused lens in the way that you lead Achieve Australia?
Yeah, look, I actually started off my career as a social educator in
Okay.
one of the very first group homes in Australia,
Okay.
and that was a group of nuns who had met Wolfensberger and
Well.
decided to close their boarding school and start up some group homes, and really was the cutting edge of disability support in those days. And so I started off my career whilst I was putting myself through uni, looking after 6 kids, like you'd never, no mobile phone, you had 6 kids and myself overnight and on weekends, things like that. Never do that to my staff these days, but I loved it. And have worked in various operational roles throughout my career. And so no doubt I do, take a great interest and am really connected to what's happening for my clients and for my staff. And really, I think that has really helped for me to understand when I'm making decisions or setting policy or setting new strategic directions, is what's it like really for the person on that day-to-day lived experience. I think that's really important. And so I take a great interest, but I don't dip in and I don't manage them.
Yeah.
Don't really want to.
No,
I've
no.
got some
Yeah.
really clever, talented staff that know what they're doing, and but I do take a very deep interest in making sure that the quality of our services, are live up to what we say they're going to. And that's not to say that they always do. There are times that I find things out and please explain, and how are we going to fix this, and how are we going to make this better. So always interested to lean into that. But yeah, I think as I said, that I've been that person who has always been aspirational about what I want for people with disabilities, and that um, it was part of my life. My mum had a disability, and I grew up not really recognizing that, because she just did what she did and got on with her life, and expected that she had things that tools and tricks that helped her live a life without too much support. But it really normalized disability in our lives and made me see that people just need the right supports, and then they can just get on with life. And that's the aspirations that I hold for people, that they can live the best life that they want to, whatever that looks like.
Yes, exactly. Well, I love the fact that you got not just the ops, but that kind of grassroots involvement in terms of your career, because I'm sure that the benefit for the organization is that everyone doing the doing knows that there's a grounded in reality direction of the organization. Like you've done it
Sure.
yourself, it's great.
Yeah, and when somebody comes to me and says that'll never work, and I think, yeah, maybe it won't,
Right.
because I remember what it's like, and
Yeah.
managing group homes or managing services, you remember what it's like, and you're jumping from a life and death situation to whether somebody's got their bus pass to, then having to implement some silly policy that somebody in head office has designed. So it
Exactly.
does, and I always want to keep that as a focus, so I can make sure that I'm not asking anybody, whether it's the client at the end of the day or the person who's supporting them, to do something that's not going to work. or
Yeah,
that's actually
exactly.
going to make life more complicated for them.
Exactly. Now we're recording this in August 2023. So July has just passed. We've had the price guide increase. Some areas did not increase. So
Mm,
the support coordination and plan management didn't, which is somewhat controversial. But if you
mm.
talk about personal care, community access, SIL, we had approximately a 5% increase in prices. But the SHADS award also matched that 5% increase as well.
Well, it
You
was
know,
5.75.
yeah, sure. So quite rightly so, I get that as well because we're in an inflationary environment, right? So
Mm,
everyone
mm.
needs to live. Um, so my question, nevertheless, is if we zone in on the price guide in particular, do you feel like the scheme has done a sufficient job to keep up with inflationary costs broadly across the market and across the scheme?
Yeah, look, I mean that's a complicated
Mm,
question in that there's no doubt that the bump in service in prices last year, particularly for some line items, was really helpful. It
mm,
got a lot of organisations out of trouble.
mm,
Having said that, most organisations and big organisations that I know have recorded losses for the past 3 or 4 years, and that's not sustainable. And
mm,
they continue to record losses. And so they're not anticipating that this financial year will be any different.
mm,
So, I think that last year, as I said, helped. This year, from my perspective, we'd done a whole lot of work on building sustainability.
mm,
We'd made some shrewd decisions around selling our property, so we've got some good reserves
mm,
in terms of investments, and we make sure that we invest a lot of that back into our foundation, for example, which is focused on research and innovation. So we put it all back into
mm,
supporting people with disability. But we know that we're sustainable into the future, and I think not for profits certainly have to be not for loss. You
mm,
can't live in an environment where you're sustaining losses all the time.
mm,
So I don't think it's fixed, and the that's borne out in the actual bottom lines of most organisations, particularly the big organisations, some of
mm,
whom are facing existential threat.
mm,
And so the big therapy providers I know are greatly struggling because
mm,
of the lack of real increases in prices in therapy.
mm,
And I know that's a fraught area anyway, because
mm,
what you can charge as a therapy provider providing really complex um, expert support to someone with a complex disability
mm,
is the same as what the guy down the road who has just put up their shingle can charge. And so that's a really fraught area in terms of therapy prices. But a lot of the big providers that are focused in mainly on therapy are really struggling
mm,
to make ends meet.
mm,
Support coordination and plan management, of course, I'm not sure what the political, I've got my theories about what all that means.
mm,
But support coordination hasn't had a rise for some time, and so that
mm,
is once again quite tricky, and that providers are not, that just feeds into it becoming even more of a transactional service where you just stick to the hour, you do your thing, and I don't think that's effective
mm.
in the longer term.
Yes.
So the short answer is that the sector's still struggling,
Yes.
and there are, as I said, serious viability issues. I think that on the whole, um, if you look at the results of the Ability Roundtable, which is a benchmarking exercise that looks at all the big providers that have signed up, and their financial viability.
Mm,
I think that it's a minus 2.5% on average. Some are really struggling. Others, like us, have a small margin
mm,
um, that means that we're sustainable.
mm,
But it's a year-to-year proposition,
mm. Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
it's not an environment where this rhetoric that we're all making millions of dollars and swimming in money is complete and utter rubbish.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. There's what you alluded to there are the various microcosms. So there's a microcosm of what's going on for therapies. There's microcosm of COS, PM, you know, the SIL sector, SDA sector. There's all sorts of challenges in each one. So you got to know what each ecosystem has going on for itself. Now,
and
I
it's
guess,
not like the old days where you had a margin in one and you could prop up the other. It doesn't work that way anymore,
right.
because you've got really no margin in anything, and so you're not sort of borrowing Peter to pay Paul. You know, borrowing off your SIL because you're spending all your money in SIL. You know, we've got huge compliance costs. The overhead allocation in SIL is really small, and not doesn't cover all your back of house or your corporate costs, and then when you add on the huge compliance costs that we have, and so you're not making money from that, and so therefore, if you've got then a service like support coordination, and that should sit in a completely different your organisation from a conflict of interest perspective. But if you've got support coordination therapy or any other service, you're certainly not in a position to prop those up, and most of them are making very, very large losses.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So let me ask you one final philosophical question. It's about unregistered providers, right? So gosh, it's a really interesting subject too, not an easy answer. But basically, you know, quite rightly, choice and control is the key cornerstone of the whole scheme. So I absolutely agree with the idea that we should be able to, as participants, be able to choose whether we go with an unregistered provider or a registered provider. Now, having said that, unregistered providers are bound by the code of ethics, but registered providers go by the practice standards, which are much more rigid, etc. So it's very interesting to observe that 40%, last time I read a report on this, it was 40% of payments are going to unregistered providers. So it's huge, absolutely huge. Now, there are definitely, even though everything I just said exists and is real, there are arguably some challenges and some limitations of that side of the market. So my question is, should there be a greater strive toward registration? And I'm not saying unilaterally, I'm just talking about a direction and a strive.
So, yeah, look, in the current regulatory environment, requiring every provider to be registered is probably not realistic, and as you pointed out, is going to really limit choice and control. So I stand by that. You know, there's room for unregistered providers in the market. Having said that, you know, there's got to be greater oversight of unregistered providers, and there's got to be, and I hesitate to say a relaxing, but a change in the requirements for registered providers, because at the moment we can all charge the same price.
Right.
And, you know, registered providers have a huge impost around compliance. And, you know, I absolutely believe in oversight, and I believe in, you know, I'm hand on heart, will do anything that the Commission asks me to report on, because I think it makes for better service delivery. But at the same time, the costs of that are huge. And, you know, an unregistered provider doesn't have those costs, and at the same time it doesn't have the oversight that's required. So there's got to be some meeting in the middle, and I think some kind of tiered arrangement where you know, people had a set of standards that they had to comply with, but there was not an onerous requirement around some of those smaller unregistered providers to do the kinds of things that we necessarily have to do. We provide really complex support, so of course we have to you know, be open and transparent and do all the things we have to do. But there also needs to be a bit of tiered pricing, I think, in that, to make sure that acknowledges the extraordinary costs that a registered provider faces.
Exactly. Yeah, agree. And I think that would be a great outcome, because, like, imagine if, for example, if you had some kind of extra loading that registered providers would receive to cover the compliance overhead, that would be great. And of course, that should not come at the penalisation of dwindling down a participant's budget. Maybe there needs to be, you know, supplementation on the plan side as well to make that happen.
For sure.
Fine line. It's a fine line. And also, I know that, you know, the actual, even the registration process, gosh, you know, it used to take a few months or whatever. Now it's so common that I'm hearing it, because I coach people on this, like, well, not on registration, but in sales and marketing. But I hear the story all the time that the registration application process even after passing audit, it's like waiting 12
Yep.
months more. So there's
Yep.
such a
Yep.
backlog. It's
And you
crazy.
have a team of people who are, you know, completely focused on it. It's
Yeah,
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 it's
absolutely.
very onerous. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, listen, Joanne, it's been a pleasure having a chat with you today. We'll wrap it up here, but you know, for people that want to learn more about Achieve Australia, we'll include, of course, the show notes, the link to the website.
Great.
And yeah, it's been a pleasure having a chat with you today. If you found this interesting from a scaling point of view, my business Peak Provider and myself, Chris Hall, we do scaling projects. So that's a brief mention to the services that we do. But Joanne Hewitt, Achieve Australia, you are a legend. It's been a pleasure to connect with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your deep philosophy and values on the sector.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a great conversation.
Good on you. Take care.